Let's get started by talking about architectural heritage and balancing that with needing to put the sufficient density in downtown areas that, population growth, changing living habits, and climate change are going to make necessary. How do you balance architectural heritage with density?
Well, I just think that the combination of new and old, short and tall, big and small, can be mesmerising in all cities. And I think just the display of the different layers of history can really enhance downtown districts and actually allow greater density. I think the biggest issue is actually working out which buildings deserve heritage status, not just because they're old. They need to be the right type of building. I think architects have a responsibility and a role to play in that. And I think in overall terms, I just love cheek by jowl relationship of one building to another, and we see that in the City of London in particular. And I think China is just starting to recognise the value that can be had from old and new. And as I say, for me, you'll get more density out of a city by actually having that dynamic combination of the two beside each other.
Do you have a favorite cheek by jowl relationship like
that? For me, it's the City of London. And if you look at Leadenhall Market, which is one of the great historic markets, and you look at the context there, we've got the Lloyd's building, the Cheese Grater on the other side, the Willis building. All of those buildings are fantastic, new 21st century buildings, and they sit beside the 19th century, and the scale of that is very, very different. And I think it's a really interesting point, because if you look at a lot of heritage buildings, they're inherently low rise and actually do a great job at mitigating between the street and the building. And if you can use that, you can actually use that as a really successful way of integrating between the street and a taller building. And I suppose the Hearst building in New York is a good example of where that has been taken on recently, where you have a frontage and a scale and a street scale, which then transforms into a much larger development. And that mitigation that's been given by the heritage building actually enhances both.
What qualifies as a vertical community in your mind, as opposed to just disparate uses stacked on top of one another?
For me, vertical community, as opposed to just the stacking of disparate uses, is all about, is really about three things. For me, the first one is about accessibility, the idea that it's inclusive. The fact that people that use those buildings have the confidence to use them and it doesn't become exclusive. The second thing is adaptability, the idea that it can change over time as people evolve, as things change, as the economic climate changes. And finally, I think it's about user confidence, the idea that people using a mixed-use building actually have the confidence to enter into it and have the confidence to actually move around and go from one use to another. And for me, that's the big difference. If you look at mixed-use buildings which are just different uses, it's quite difficult to be able to say, yeah, I'm going to confidently go to a hotel, because you feel as though you're going through other people's territory. And that openness for me is the real key to creating a successful vertical community as opposed to just a mixture of uses.
Do you think there's a better way to integrate public space throughout high rises than we currently have?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a point, it's a critical point that I think that genuinely we don't integrate the public realm well enough. I think there's a clear division between the public realm of the street and the interior, and if we can break down those barriers, it can only be to the success of any building, and a tall building in particular, because the risk is that tall buildings are often seen as exclusive developments rather than inclusive developments. And the more that we can open up the base and the more that we can encourage people into and through buildings, I can only see as being to the benefit of the city and also the buildings themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So more of a sky city than a forest of skyscrapers.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you could pick one design, tall building design, development, operations or management, research topic that you think needs more research, more work, what would it be and why?
For me, it will be external space. And the reason why I say that is that there is no doubt that tall buildings are a sustainable building topology for the future. We talk about density and we talk about bringing into city centres, and we see population growth, and as a result of that, tall buildings are the way to go. For me, the issue is the potential disconnect between people in the inside of those buildings and the outside. And ultimately, I think if you look at human nature is really about being, we're ground dwellers. We don't naturally go high, and as a result of that, the connection with the outside world is critical to our health and well-being. And the more that we ask people to occupy tall buildings, the more I genuinely believe we need to engage with the outside world. And I think that, for me, the making more successful external spaces is critical. I also believe it's not just about design, it's also about the value that can be generated, because clearly there's a reason why not many external spaces have been incorporated into buildings, and that's to do with cost and program and the implications of the economics. And what we have to do is to work with the cost planners and our clients to actually demonstrate that those spaces add value and are not seen as a problem to a project. They can actually really enhance it. And I think ultimately, if you think about the way in which we're asking more and more people to live in high-rise buildings, live in tall buildings, and we look at what constitutes a home, many people will say a garden or an external space is a critical part of their health and well-being, of just the act of living. Right. And as a result of that, that's why I think the research into external space, the benefit, and as I say, not just because of design but also the economics, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and maybe just the trend of people moving into high-rises, more types of people living in high-rises, and just more people generally will help move that along, because the new types of users demand new programs.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, it's the way in which we think about the type of people who'll be residing in these properties. So if we think of, typically, we think of high-rise buildings probably accommodating more of a transient population or community, where people are renting, and maybe renting for a few months, a few years.
And office workers, certainly not there most of the day.
Absolutely. So the more that we're asking for people to spend more time, or more time, parts of their life, living within one building, the more I genuinely believe access to external space is crucial to not only the success of the people that live and work in those buildings, but also the success of those buildings in their entirety.
Let's ask about some of your individual projects.
Yeah.
Taberner House in London and Carrington Street. What have you learned from those projects, specifically, locating diverse programs near transit hubs? And do you think that typology is something that should be shared more widely than it is now?
Absolutely. It's really interesting. Those two projects are different in their context. However, the results are comparable, in my opinion. Their contexts are different because Taberner House is a residential scheme and Carrington Place is an office scheme. However, both of them are located around transport interchanges, but in different contexts. Taberner House is really a suburban or a satellite of London, whereas Wynyard Place is right in the heart of the central business district. And the results are different. If we just look at Taberner House, Croydon is a satellite of London. It is extremely well connected in terms of accessibility, but it also has a heart and soul of itself. It has the amenity facilities, it has the cultural facilities, it has the retail, which actually make it a great place to live. And that's why it's attractive, and that's why it's a great proposition for building tall buildings on in and around that transport interchange. The challenge is then creating the right environment for people to live. And this comes down to the fact that as a transport interchange, it's busy, it's noisy, there are pollution issues. And what we need to do is to start thinking about the way in which people live in those. And rather than thinking, we need to be starting to think more about residences than apartments, thinking of homes rather than units in the way in which we refer to the property. So we have a residential scheme, and what we have concentrated on is delivering the highest quality spaces with buffer zones and intermediate spaces to create effectively an oasis, to create that space of calm for people to call home. Now, Carrington Street in Sydney is different in terms of it's a workplace and it's in the central business district. And what we have done there is taken the opportunity of not just relying on its natural assets, which are that it's well connected, but actually investing in the quality of the office space, creating external terraces, creating a space which actually becomes well known, and ultimately we believe will become an aspirational place for people to work because it's highly visible. Many people will be passing by or through it on their way to the railway station. But what we've done is consciously worked on making it an emblematic workplace, so that children who may be going through the city centre now will actually be looking at that building and thinking, yeah, I want to work in there. That's my ambition, to work in that building because it's such a fantastic building, but located in the heart of the city centre, close to all of the amenities. So we've tackled both of those situations in a similar way. However, their contexts are very, very different.
And then I guess applying that idea to different contexts around the world would similarly adapt those sorts of things.
Absolutely. But the bottom line is building tall around transport interchanges is a no-brainer, to use that parlance. It's absolutely the right thing to do, to put concentration, to put density in a place which is the most accessible place in a city is really, really logical, because what we're doing there is making sure that people can get to and from those places easily, because ultimately we're talking about urban dwellers, and urban dwellers will rely on public transport. They will rely on accessibility to get to work, to go to the swimming pool, to go to the park, to do all of those things. And what we want to do is to make people's lives a whole lot easier.
Earlier there was a conversation in one of these interviews about transit nodes, specifically it was in Hong Kong, so the context is important. But, comparing cities with a really clear, dense downtown, New York, Chicago with, say, Sao Paulo, or a more spread out one with lots of just high-rises seeming to go on forever and just nodes, and they may be transit nodes, so they are well connected and dense, but the city center is kind of elusive, and there's kind of a difference in character of the city. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. My view is a clear hierarchy is important. The idea of a identifiable, recognisable downtown is essential. It's the place where either people are working or they're going for recreation or amenity or culture. The idea that you can identify a specific centre is crucial. Then the concept of having satellites is fine by me in terms of my understanding, because it's very logical. They're radiating or they're organised around a central district. For me, when there's an even hand and you're not really sure where the centre is, it's an agglomeration of buildings, that becomes very difficult. I believe it becomes difficult in terms of just overall navigation and orientation within the city, but also just having a sense of identity. Where's the sense of place? And the idea of congregation, the idea that in any city you can say there's a place or there's a building which you would recognise as being the centre. For me, I think is fundamental to any master planning or city planning in the future. And I think you're right. Or your observation is right in terms of the more that cities sprawl, that becomes less desirable for people to live in. So the Wanda Hotel was a really important project to us, and the first one is it does something which all architects should aspire to, is to take what is potentially an ordinary building or an ordinary building topology and turning it into something extraordinary. We didn't spend necessarily any more money. We used design to take a brief and turn it into something which just exceeded everyone's expectations. Now, interestingly, we approached it from the inside out. So the design of that facade is for a hotel, and the defining character is a series of lenses in the facade which relate to the individual rooms of the hotel. So each room effectively has a bay window, and that bay window is then focused in a lens window, which is then repeated as a pattern across the whole building. So we start with the micro scale, we start with the individual, we start with the module of a hotel room, relate our facade design to the interior design, and then look at how we can then work that across the whole elevation to create something which in in my opinion, is marvellous. The way in which we get texture and we get scale and we get pattern, which is applied to the entire building, and effectively we have one building which is in a cluster of buildings, and it stands out. It stands out because it's been handled in an intelligent and a responsive way, and has now become one of the emblems of the city. You see it as you come into the city itself by rail. However, one of the interesting things that we learned was actually the facade industry in China. We inherently want to prefabricate, yet the construction industry, and I would suggest that there is a lot of labour that's available within China, naturally leads to a more on-site construction methodology. Sure. So whilst we would inherently think those panels would be prefabricated, actually there was a lot of fabrication on site, and the installation was put together in a different way. And I think what that does is leads us to how can we become more intelligent in terms of prefabrication in our facade design. Things that we take for granted in a country like China is an emerging technology. And for us, when we translate that to really tall buildings, for us it's the way forward. So prefabrication is essential. So we see it in facade design, where we have panels that we can install, and there's quality, there's safety, and ultimately there's program advantages to all of that. And on mid-rise buildings, arguably you could say, well, you could take a choice. But as soon as we get into the super tall buildings, what we see is that prefabrication has to be the way forward. And the best analogy I can give is really when you look at those people that are organising expeditions. So the analogy is great for me, because building a tall building is doing something in relatively arduous conditions. If you think of climbing a mountain, you think of installing something on a tall building, you're doing it at height, you're doing it at great exposure. And if you look at the way expeditions are put together, they will be planned meticulously. There will be supply posts on the way up to ensure that those that are actually making the journey, as it were, are doing it to maximise the or minimise the amount of effort that they're putting into it. They're saving their energy, and they're using it to optimise their effort in order to reach the summit. So I think the analogy can be made with building a tall building. Why wouldn't you do it? And finally, the other analogy I think is a Formula One racing car. If you think of that, you've got this high performance machine, and when it crosses the finishing line, there won't be a drop of fuel left in its fuel tank, because it will have been optimised so that it crosses the line, having made sure it didn't carry any excess weight. And for us, prefabrication in tall buildings has to be embraced more, and it's not just the facade design, but it's also the prefabrication of other elements.